It had been 5 years since the Church Missionary Society, Thomas Kendall, and his fellow clergymen had established their first mission station at Rangihoa and had recently established another at Kerekere under the patronage of Ngāpuhi chief, Hongi Hika. Kendall, wishing to become ordained as a priest and also wanting to contribute toward the publication of a grammar text, which was being compiled at Queen's College by Professor Samuel Lee, had made plans for Hongi and himself to travel to England. Hongi had already visited Port Jackson or Sydney in 1814, but wanted to travel to England to see the multitude of people, the goodness of the land, and acquire a sizeable cache of firearms for his future military goals. The Reverend Samuel Marsden, known in New South Wales as the flogging parson, discovered Kendall's plans shortly before he was to depart and was not in favour of him travelling to England. Marsden had promised to facilitate a voyage to England for Hongi previously, and Kendall had earned leave, so Marsden reluctantly permitted his subordinate and the chief to make the journey. The three men said their farewells to their families and boarded the whaling ship, the New Zealander, ready for a long voyage to England. Waikato, a Te Hikatu chief, joined Hongi and Thomas Kendall and served as a translator and an aide-de-camp, despite being a chief in his own right. The trio's journey to England was a long and arduous one, of 5 months' duration and crossing a number of oceans across the globe. It took far longer than both chiefs had originally anticipated, and without a lot to do on the ship, the journey became tiresome at times. On their arrival in England on the 8th of August 1820, their welcome was anything but warm, which would have disappointed the two chiefs, as a measure of hospitality would have been expected by them. The only reason they were welcomed at all was the fact that the church did not want to offend Hongi and hinder their future religious aspirations in New Zealand. As Kendall had previously compiled and published Aotearoa New Zealand, or the New Zealander's first book in 1815, being the first book published in Te Reo Māori, he was directed to assist Professor Samuel Lee, an academic at Queen's College, Cambridge University, who was currently working on another text of the same kind. Professor Lee had had some assistance from Tuai and Titere, two Ngāti chiefs who had visited England 2 years earlier in 1818, but had relied heavily on the prior work of Kendall in compiling his own. Whilst in England, 2 paintings of the men were commissioned by the Church Missionary Society, one of Hongi and Waikato by John Jackson, and another of all 3 of the men by James Barry. The portrait of the trio of men was hung in the Church Missionary Society headquarters in London, where it would stay for nearly a century. Whilst in London, the 3 men were hosted by the Reverend Basil Woods, who provided Thomas Kendall with a letter of recommendation to be ordained as a priest, something that Reverend Marsden would not have condoned. Hongi gifted his pounamu heitiki to Wood as a display of appreciation for his hospitality. An introduction of note was the meeting and friendship between Hongi French law student Charles Philippe de Thierry, with whom an agreement had been made to trade approximately 400 muskets, powder and shot for a tract of land near Hokianga, land which Hongi did not yet own. Hongi would take every opportunity to learn about European military strategy and tactics. He was especially interested in the relatively recent conflict, the Battle of Waterloo. Whilst in Cambridge, he had access to a multitude of personal and educational resources. Not having immunity to European illnesses or diseases, Hongi was struck down with influenza. Many of those who saw his state of sickness feared that he would succumb to the illness. However, he was nursed back to health over a period of time by Miss Lee, who cared for him and provided him with hot tea and soup. On the 21st of October 1820, Hongi and Waikato were introduced to the Peerage in the House of Lords. The Lords were intrigued by their appearance, especially the facial markings. Although Hongi and Waikato were being feted by English high society and being invited to soirees and fairs all across the countryside, they did manage to spend a fair amount of time at Queen's College, assisting Professor Samuel Lee and Thomas Kendall with the compilation of a manuscript, which would turn out to be a grammar and vocabulary of the language of New Zealand. This would be published in November, prior to their departure. On the 13th of November 1820, Hongi and Waikato were granted an audience with King George IV at Carlton House. The two leaders addressed each other, with Hongi saying, "How do you do, King George?" with the king replying, "How do you do, King Hongi?" The pair of chiefs gifted the king their cloaks, placing them at the regent's feet. The two rangatira were given a tour of the residence, which was a palace in orbit name, and were also shown the collection of weapons in the royal armoury, which was upstairs. Hongi and Waikato were given a number of gifts. These included double-barreled flintlock sporting guns, military straight swords, officers' gilt-mounted helmets, leather stocks, shakos, red military coats, and halbergs, more commonly known as chainmail suit of armour. The king also took the two chiefs on a tour of the Tower of London, where they visited the Tower Armoury and saw the thousand guns which Tuai had spoken of when he returned to New Zealand. The two chiefs were also able to visit the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, where Hongi took a particular interest. The two chiefs, accompanied by Sir John Mortlock and Lady Jane Pym, visited the Royal Menagerie, or the zoo, where they saw animals like lions and elephants and bears. On a list of things that Hongi wanted to bring back to New Zealand on his return was a lion. Fortunately, it was crossed out and replaced with a large brown dog. Thomas Kendall met the Right Reverend Henry Bathurst, Bishop of Norwich, to be interviewed regarding his possible ordination as a priest. Having highly respectable referees and impressing the bishop during his interview, Thomas Kendall was subsequently ordained a priest at Norwich Cathedral by Bishop Bathurst. Hongi, having met the king and securing an agreement for a large cache of firearms, and Kendall, who had received his priestly orders and seen his work, A Grammar and Vocabulary of the Language of New Zealand, published before their departure, decided, after having been away from home for 10 months, to return to New Zealand, their main objectives having been achieved. One evening, as Hongi was walking back to his lodging in Port Jackson, after having dinner at an establishment in York Street, former convict John Wilson stole Hongi's pocket watch and made off momentarily. The thief didn't get far before he was run down by a livid chief, who meted out his own measure of justice before handing him over to authorities.
Yeah.
Wilson was sentenced to a public flogging consisting of 100 lashes before being sent to prison in Port Macquarie for 12 months, hard labour.
Go back to work.
It was here in the colony of New South Wales that Hongi collected his cache of weapons in readiness to take them back to New Zealand. Hongi selected a number of poo or muskets for his own personal use, which he named after past losses by his tribe and sub-tribe, and after previous battles, his favourite gun being called Teke Tanumia, in remembrance of his sister, who sacrificed her life so that Hongi could escape at the Battle of Moromanui also known as Te Kai a Te Kararo and Te Hainga o Te One in 1807.
Te Moroma Nui.
During their time in South Creek near St Mary's and in Parramatta, they crossed paths with Ngāti Paoa chief Te Hinaki and his son. Te Hinaki had originally planned on travelling to England, but after asking Hongi what his intentions were with his guns, quickly found out that he and his iwi or tribe were his targets, so he returned to Tāmaki Makaurau or Auckland post-haste to prepare for battle. By September 1821, Te Hinaki and many of his people were dead, and Hongi and his fellow chiefs would lead war parties across the North Island, waging war on enemies he was seeking revenge on for slain members of his own family. Other iwi began securing firearms of their own, some for protection, others to wage war on their enemies. But in the end, the musket wars impacted on Māori society at such a level that it caused deep mamae and hara, death, destruction of villages, slavery and displacement of peoples. It's a part of our history, events that we all hold different perceptions of, and of which we tell differing stories, none of which are more or less valid. This is but one of those pūrākau, one of those stories.